in order to get started, let me just share how we see the industry here at IHS Markit before we start to take some of the questions from some of our panelists. It is very important, or I need to clarify that these are our own internal viewpoints, and they may or may not share with some of the thought process that we have, right here. So in order to get started, let me just share a few slides here with you before we migrate over to the crust of the presentation. We are currently going through a somewhat turbulent recovery cycle for the automotive industry globally. We came out of the pandemic, and we're certainly coming out a lot stronger than what we had originally envisioned. But we're also going through a constraint in raw materials, particularly microchips. As a result, when we start to think about US light vehicle sales, we were coming in at a SAAR rate that was rather strong towards the end of the last quarter, 2020, and we're certainly going to take a more conservative outlook throughout the next few quarters while we start to normalize the availability of microchips and therefore the availability of products at plants. As a result, while the outlook of US light vehicle sales of 16.5 million units was totally feasible back in November or December, that is certainly not going to be the case for this year. And the US is in a very distinct situation where vehicles are actually being prioritized for the market given the margins that we have. During this cycle, it is also important to mention that we are seeing a strong presence of light trucks within the marketplace, and this is likely to last for the foreseeable future. Also important to keep in mind is what are the implications that we've had from a North American outlook in regards to where production is going to be at. And if we start to think about all of the installed capacity that we have seen over the last 20 or 30 years, particularly thinking about the plants that came into the southern US states, the investment that was made in Mexico, and last but not least, thinking about some of the additional plants that are now going to come into the US, such as the Mazda-Toyota partnership, we're looking at a little bit of excess capacity further down the road. As a result, while we had envisioned volumes, production volumes of close to 17 million units, chances are we will see volumes below that, particularly for this year, where we've had to revise our outlook down by roughly about 400,000 units due to the lack of microchip availability. With that, let me stop sharing my screen here and now direct the first question to Mr. Jose Sosaya. Companies in Mexico have increased production capacity to about 5 million units, but the country has not yet reached the 4 million production mark. How will Mexico address the idle production capacity problem? What are the other elements that are contributing to it?
Thank you, Guido, for the very interesting question, and thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this Mexico Automotive Summit. It's a very interesting question that takes us back to what happened over the last decade. And let us remember that after the global economic crisis in 2008, 2009, there were 8 companies in Mexico that had manufacturing facilities. And by 2017, there were 5 more, and announcements of new projects to increase production capacity of those already installed. In those years, we expected that by 2020, we would be having production volumes close to the 5 million vehicles, of which about 80% would be exported. That is about 4 million units, and in fact, production trend registered positive annual growth rates from 2011 to 2017. The highest production volume in the history of the automobile industry in Mexico were reached in 2017-2018 period with 3.9 million units. So this meant close to 80% of total production capacity used, and with a promising outlook for the coming years. Between 2017 and 2020, several non-industry unforeseen circumstances were to impact our industrial sector operations. The main one is uncertainty, and generated by general change consideration on the benefits of globalization and a trend towards regionalization and the return of nationalism. Along with it, it was increasing trade war between China and the United States. Uncertainty in the case of Mexico was also fueled by USMCA, beginning of negotiations in August 2017 that would last until November 2019, when the treaty was finally signed. They entered into force on the 1st of July 2020. There was also the political unrest caused by the elections and the new administration that took place in December 2018. If these were not enough, at the end of 2019, we were alerted by the health emergency caused by SARS-CoV-2 virus that would unleash the pandemic COVID-19 that has hit the world for more than a year and has not yet been controlled, which forced governments around the world to adopt general confinement measures that in turn have led to an increase in demand for semiconductors and thus the disruption of the production chain of certain automotive components affecting global vehicle production. The complex and unprecedented scenario has led to a sharp decrease of installed capacity occupation of to 66%. Considering that we export 84% of total production and that the main destination of our export is North American region that takes 87% of light vehicles exported by Mexico. We expect that we could return to pre-pandemic use of installed production capacity within the next 2 to 3 years. I hope that with those comments, I have answered your question.
You have indeed, and thank you so much for your comments. At this point of time, I would like to invite Mr. John Bozzella to tell us a little bit about what is the influence of the new U.S. administration in the automotive sector, both in the U.S. as well as the region.
Thank you very much for that question, and thanks for having me here today. And just a quick note about Alliance for Automotive Innovation. We're a new trade association based in the United States that represents 99% of new vehicle sales in the United States, as well as tier 1 suppliers, tech companies, and new entrants to the mobility space. And so this is a broader industry engagement with policymakers that recognizes not only the industry as it is today, but the industry as it's becoming. To your question about the Biden administration, there is no question that we see a much different approach to automotive policy now than we've seen in the recent past. And I would argue to you that this is a policy approach that is more comprehensive, almost a 360-degree view of the auto industry and policy. And I think that that's important and frankly positive and heartening for those of us who are involved in this industry across the region. The Biden administration has 4 priorities. 1, they must respond to and end the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. That is critical, and that is running through the veins of this entire administration in every agency. Secondly, they need to focus on rebuilding the U.S. economy. Third, they need to combat climate change. And fourth, they are focused on addressing social justice and equity concerns. And I think it's important for us as an industry to recognize, especially with those second 3, climate change and the economy and equity and social justice, that this administration is going to be focusing on policies that attempt to address all 3 at the same time. And so that does focus the administration's climate policies, for example, on American jobs. It focuses the administration's climate policy on addressing fence line communities, as we might call them, or communities that tend to be underrepresented with regard to the availability of new vehicle technologies in the US marketplace. So I think it's very important to recognize this broader perspective that the Biden administration will be taking. Last point I would make is that what you're going to see as the first expression of this policy is really in the Biden administration's Build Back Better infrastructure program, $3 trillion worth of potential new spending identified to really shift into a new auto industry, more charging infrastructure, a focus on supply chain and production retooling, as well as supporting consumer awareness and purchase of new technologies. And so that's really where we're going to see the expression of this policy at the very beginning. And the last point I'd make is, even in the United States and even in this industry where scale is as immense as it is, $3 trillion is real money. And so I do think we'll see a much broader engagement with policymakers in the United States and the industry.
Great comments. Thank you so much. Let's continue trekking further up north and listening to two of our speakers in Canada. I'd like to invite Mr. David Adams as well as Jean-Francois Champagne to let us know what their thoughts are, particularly in a succinct manner as far as to, if you're starting to look at Canada's auto sector as well as Mexico, it is strongly linked to the United States. What are the challenges and opportunities the Canadian market is facing in 2021? So if you could please take 3 minutes each, I would greatly appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for your introductory comments, Guido. I appreciate it. Canada, as you noted, like Mexico, is fully dependent really on the United States auto market. Canadian market has been linked with the US market since about 1965 under the Canada-US Auto Pact. And really, that was for the purposes of garnering scale, economies of scale, and for creating efficiencies into the industry such that ultimately consumer prices could be reduced to the end consumer. Through the evolution of trade policy, through the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, through NAFTA, now through the USMCA, that access has continued to be secured for Canada, and that's important as we move forward here. Challenges and opportunities in the Canadian marketplace have been more opportunity now, I would suggest, to John's comments about the new administration in the United States. Our environmental policies, our emissions policies, and our safety standards are largely directly correlated with those of the United States. So we've had a government in Canada for the last 8 years, I guess now, that's been specifically oriented towards achieving some fairly significant climate change goals, whereas the previous administration in the US has not been oriented that way. So I think there's now more opportunity for the two countries together to move forward into the areas of advanced technology vehicles and advanced propulsion technology vehicles that John alluded to in his remarks. Obviously, the pandemic has had effects on the industry in Canada. Our production was down about 20% last year. Our sales were also down about 20% in Canada as well. And with the ongoing issues that have already been mentioned by previous speakers of chip shortages and ongoing inventory concerns through logistics and continued pandemic lag, I think we're not all that optimistic that we'll achieve much greater sales this year. Maybe with that, I'll leave it and turn it over to Jean-Francois.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, David. And again, thanks for the invitations to participate on this great platform today. I'd like to first off just mention that the Automotive Industries Association of Canada is probably a little different than some of the other participants in the sense that we primarily represent people in the automotive aftermarket. So not so much focused on the manufacturing and sales of new vehicle, but very focused on the maintenance and servicing of vehicle after they're being sold. And I would like to, many respects, echo some of the comment from David that we're definitely seeing with the new U.S. administration a much better alignment on the policy front of the two countries, and I think is going to be definitely beneficial. And with, again, the implementation of the USMCA, greater potential for collaborations. And equally in the automotive aftermarket, as we are in the manufacturing of new vehicle, we are increasingly dependent upon the integration of our relationships to the U.S. partners, but also as at the North American region as a whole. When we look at 2021, again, our sector is slightly different in the terms of how it's been impacted by the COVID pandemic. The main driver of our economic activity and the automotive aftermarket are mostly driven on three factors. And the first one is the existing park of vehicle on the road, and that is across, again, the North American region continue to grow. So we're just seeing more vehicle to maintain on Canadian or just across all of North American roads. Secondly, we also are obviously very focused on what's the average age of those vehicles on the road, and that is also an indicator that continues to increase. People are simply keeping their cars longer, requiring obviously more dollars spent by miles driven as the vehicle ages. But thirdly, and that's probably one of the challenges facing our sector of the economy, is also looking at overall miles driven. And that is obviously something where we've seen a very sharp decrease through the year 2020. And I think we're really trying to put our fingers on the pulse as to what is going to be the long-term impact on the reductions of miles driven as the result of the pandemic, and how much time really is going to take to go back to mileage we've seen pre-pandemic. And this is going to have obviously an impact on the maintenance or repairs of vehicle. But in the meantime, faced with difficulty on the supply front of new vehicle, Canadians and I guess people throughout the North American region have continued to use an existing or keeping another vehicle longer. And so that has provided obviously some great opportunities for the aftermarket, which again, despite the reductions of mile driven, continues to overall fare fairly well in light of what we've seen in 2020.
Great, thank you. Let me go back to Mr. Bozzella as well as Mr. Adams. Are about the fact that with USMCA in place, how does the treaty promote the adoption of electric and hybrid vehicles as well as regional battery production?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. We're just obviously seeing the companies engaged in the retooling and reinvestments necessary to comply with the new, more stringent automotive rules associated with USMCA. So we are seeing investment and cost coming into the region. The rules also modernized their approach to automotive technology, and I think that those new modernized rules, I think, do align fairly well with the types of investments that are required to meet higher levels of electrification, greater fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions reductions, especially if you look at the core elements of those rules. And let me just leave it there and turn it to David, because I think he'll have some additional perspective as it relates to the region. But I think the short answer is, a modernized USMCA should give the industry an opportunity as we reinvest to align with those goals.
Thanks very much, John. Yeah, I would echo what John has related. I think if you look at the USMCA, I guess the problem with NAFTA is that in many ways it was a pretty decent trade agreement, so much so, and it worked for all three parties reasonably well, that, if it's not broken, there was no real incentive to try and fix it. But the reality is that, it's a 25-year-old trade agreement. And a lot of the components and new vehicles and new product and what have you weren't even contemplated under the NAFTA rules. So I think certainly a modernization of NAFTA was due, just to incorporate the transition of the vehicle as we're seeing it much more from a mechanical device into a computer on wheels. And I think with respect to incentivizing the transition to electric vehicles, if we look at batteries, for instance, they're considered core parts under the agreement, and as such, they need 75% content requirement. And I think the reality is, given that the price of a battery is anywhere from 30 to 50% of the total vehicle, the incentive put in the trade agreement was to try and onshore a lot of that battery development and that battery production. Canada and the US, but I know I can only speak to Canada specifically, has been sort of seized with this idea of how do we develop the whole battery ecosystem within Canada, or in a North American space. But when we look at the investments that John alluded to that have been made by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler in their production facilities, specifically in Canada, to produce electric vehicles going forward, that's going to necessitate that we have some battery production fairly close to those production facilities. And the only other thing that I would say is that, you know, the battery, in my mind, is the real strategic driver to advanced propulsion vehicles, because that's where the value is, and you can put anything on top of the battery, but if you don't have the battery production localized, then you're missing out on a whole basically underpinnings of the new technologies. And I'll leave it with that.
Excellent. Great, wonderful comments. Let me shift over to Mr. Champagne. And with the USMCA in place, how does the treaty promote the adoption of electric and hybrid vehicles as well as regional battery production? So once again, tackling that particular question from a component perspective, which you represent, and how do you see your association playing further down the road?
Sure. And I'd like to maybe echo a bit of what we've already heard from John and David, that I think with the implementation of USMCA, that there's been a good focus in trying to make sure that within the North American region, there are the right investments to make sure we do have the battery productions here. And I think it's key. There has been some recent announcement in Canada, very encouraging about the developing of that technology right here in Canada, in the region. So I think we're already seeing those positive signs. Again, I'd like to always bit of a perspective also from an aftermarket perspective, how we're going to effectively be also able to develop the replacement parts, and the servicing industry is going to support the ongoing growing number of these vehicles that are going to require a new type of servicing, new type of parts and processes. And it's great to see that we're also seeing in Canada a good amount of development and investment in upskilling of the workforce, because this is another very important element, is that we want to make sure that the very technicians that are repairing these vehicles also have the skills, the tools, the capacity to effectively service these vehicles right here in the North American region. And so we are also seeing early sign of great innovators that are really starting to look at, okay, how we're going to ensure that not only we build these vehicles here, we sell these vehicles here, but also we're going to be able to effectively continue to effectively and safely repair these vehicles. So that's important. And I think, again, to John's point earlier, with the new administration in the United States, we're also seeing a much better alignment, I guess, on the philosophies of our respective government in regards to climate change. And that's also very key. And I think even more important that the USMCA, which to, I guess, David's point earlier, I think we were well served with the NAFTA agreement, but again, to get to the USMCA agreement is at least giving us a good footing, a good platform in light of a bit of I call it the disruption that we saw, the turbulence that was caused by tariff as an example during the previous administration. So I think having a much better alignment on the policies from our respective government is going to serve us well. And from an aftermarket perspective, really encouraged by the early investment of some innovators in that space as well.
Excellent, thank you. Let me go back to Mr. Sosaya. Mr. Sosaya, how are automakers adapting production lines in Mexico to meet a higher demand for SUVs and other segments in the US?
Thank you, Guido. Well, this is not a new trend, and it has been developing for the last 10 years. So OEMs established in our country, in Mexico, have gradually adopted to this situation. Looking at exports by segment and divided between passenger vehicles and light trucks, we can see that in 2011, light trucks exports accounted for 33.9% of the total, and by 2020, their share doubled to 68.2%. We exported 866,000 light trucks in 2011, figure that went up to 2.1 million by 2020. And of course, a more detailed analysis of this light truck segment, we may divide it between SUVs and pickup sub-segments that have an increasing trend, but with different intensities. Pickup exports have remained stable over the past decade, ranging from between 21 to 26%, Meanwhile, SUVs subsegment has more than tripled its share from 12% to 43%. Pickup export passed from 551,000 vehicles in 2011 to 779,000 in 2020, while SUVs export volumes soared from 315,000 units to 1.3 million in the same period. By contrast, relevance of cars or passenger vehicles exports, like compact and subcompact ones, has gradually decreased during 2011 to 2020 period. Based on data published by the INEGI, which is a federal agency here in Mexico, we can say that it is since 2017 when the biggest change takes place and SUVs exports become more relevant than those of cars, showing that the different brands have been gradually adjusting their strategy to market trends within our major trading partners like United States and Canada. That would be my answer.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Sosaya. And we've had some wonderful points throughout this first half of this conversation with the start that was with the comments that were made in regards to the fact that we were very much destined towards globalization until the Trump administration came along. We took a step backwards. And as a result of that step backwards, we saw a new free trade agreement for the region. This free trade agreement has resulted in more stringent rules. We are seeing a modernization of that agreement, particularly thinking about the electrification that we are going to see in a not so distant future. Now, this doesn't always necessarily translate into more regional content, but we also have to prepare our labor force with the necessary skill set to take on these challenges further down the road. Complementary to this and thinking ahead, we are now looking at a new administration that brings a new set of challenges. A new administration that is thinking about climate change very seriously, and where we are also seeing a change in the consumer with the miles that are actually driven. People like you and me staying at home and not necessarily driving as much. So these are some excellent points that have been brought up throughout this first part of the conversation. Now let's move over to the second part with a question directed towards Mr. Bozzella and Mr. Champagne. What are the boost the demand of electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles, and are the goals set by automakers achievable?
Yes, that's such an important question. And I want to start by starting where you did at the beginning of your presentation and where Jose was just sort of framing the industry perspective in Mexico. The vast majority of vehicles purchased by Americans today are SUVs and pickup trucks and CUVs. And so what we're seeing in an era of low gas prices is still a consumer focused on bigger vehicles. And so, that's the reality we live in today. And yet we see automakers have already invested, as well as suppliers and others, invested over $250 billion in electrification. So in other words, we are shifting in that direction. And we're doing it for a number of reasons. One is response to climate change and the need to continue to reduce emissions. And as we continue to make more progress, we do move from managing in the market to seeing a shift in technologies. And that's really part of what's driving this. I think the other aspect of this that's really important is we're in a global competition. And this region, the North American region, this seamless consolidation of the auto industry across Mexico, Canada, and the United States needs to be competitive. And so, because we do export out of the region, and we do need to make sure that we control our own destiny with regard to technology. Now, to your question about can we meet the broad ambitions of many companies? For example, General Motors says, look, we think we'll be zero emission vehicle focused in the marketplace with new vehicles by 2035 as an example. That is a bold ambition. What's required to support and achieve that ambition are complementary policy measures that support consumer awareness and consumer demand. Right now, the United States is at 2% of the market with regard to electric vehicles. If we're going to get to 100%, lots has to change. More focus on consumer incentives using the US tax code as well as other policies to support the reduction of the incremental cost of a zero emission vehicle relative to a gasoline vehicle. More investments in infrastructure. So we see the Biden administration proposing 550,000 new charging stations over the next several years in the United States. That is probably not even half of what's required with regard to public charging stations. And in addition to that, and I want to come back to something that Jean-Francois mentioned earlier, we also have to make sure that the entire industrial base and the supply chain and the workforce also transitions. And so we do need policies to focus on supporting manufacturing, retooling, identifying new supply chains and making sure that those are regionalized and localized so that we can support here in the region the development and manufacturing of zero emission vehicle technologies like battery electrics and plug-in hybrids as well as hydrogen fuel cells. So what we really need are complementary policy measures to support those automotive industry goals.
And I guess I'll echo some of John's comment that, again, this is all about a set of complementary policy. It really speaks to that consumer confidence. So again, from an aftermarket perspective, it's really about servicing the vehicle that the people want to drive. And if you look at, the North American region, I could speak specifically for Canada, you look at the geography, Canadians drive longer distances, use larger vehicles, and those probably not as suitable to a rapid transition to an EV or zero emission vehicles. And so that's the challenge is to let the evolution, and I always says it's an evolution, not a revolution, of the electric vehicle and zero emission vehicle towards technology that are going to be effective, work for consumer, and be price competitive. And I think it's just a question of time. We've seen so many great evolutions around the development of these technology in recent history. So it's just a matter of time that we are, or the manufacturers are able to use or provide for consumer choices that really makes it easy for consumer to make that transition. It's just a few years around the corner. Until then, we believe that consumer will continue to enjoy a larger vehicle that might be not suitable yet for a zero emission vehicle, and that we're going to continue to support a very large fleet of vehicles that are in fact internal combustion engine or hybrid models. We often, again, from the perspective of the servicing and the repair industry, I always says that, well, it's great for Canadians to buy or transitions to a zero emission vehicle, but you have to realize that the average age of the fleet, average age of vehicle in Canadian roads is 10 years old. And so to do a whole replacement of this whole fleet will take a generation. And so I applaud obviously all the efforts of the manufacturer towards this. Applaud the efforts now of policymakers that have realized that in order to increase consumer confidence, it's not just about getting that technology to a price point it's appealing to consumer, but it's also about infrastructure. It's about the capacity for Canadians specifically who drive long distances to know that they have the capacity to range to transit from point A to point B with using a zero emission vehicle. But again, from a servicing and repair industry, it's also the confidence in the consumer that if and when they do need repairs or service on these new type of technologies, that in fact the local repairer, the technicians, the technology is available to effectively, safely, and rapidly and cost effectively repair this vehicle as well. And we were seeing great efforts by policymakers, educational institutions, technology companies to move in that direction. And I see a great evolution. And while we may be slightly behind some other regions of the world, I think it speaks to our geography, our history, and we'll just transition, I think, normally over the next couple of decades. And I like those, inspirational goals that automakers have set for themselves, and hopefully we'll get there.
Wonderful comments. Mr. Sosaya, Companies such as BMW and Ford started to produce EVs and hybrids in Mexico. What is the potential to establish a comprehensive automotive production line for greater demand of EVs in the coming years?
Well, in a sense, seems to me to be a similar case that what's happened on the production and export side between SUVs and cars. Mexico has become an export hub for light vehicles. We export 85% of total production in 2019. We exported 3.3 million units in 2020. It was only 2.7 million vehicles, of which 87% went to the North American region. So this means we are focused on meeting the market trends and preferences of our major trading partners. Regarding electric vehicles, their global relevance has been gradually developing over the past decade. But however, the cost of new batteries, technology, the range of vehicles, autonomy, and the lack of infrastructure, as well as the need to generate the lowest carbon footprint as a corporate compromise, including even the generation of electric power for the recharging of electric vehicles, are some of the factors that have been on the way to faster use of these technology vehicles. For our country, it is exactly the same. The share of hybrid and electric vehicles in total domestic sales is just 2.6%, although the last 2 years have registered better sales of this type of vehicles compared to the general market performance. On the production side, as was the case of SUVs, it depends on the global corporate strategy that has to do with specific plans of each brand, as well as with the environmental protection policies adopted by the governments of different countries that makes greenhouse gas emissions regulations more strengthened. In recent years, several countries have announced that they will forbid sales of combustion engine vehicles by 2035. So OEMs have not lagged behind, and most of them have also been announcing that their new plans and programs to stop manufacturing internal combustion vehicles within the next 10 to 15 years. We think in the case of Mexico that we have the conditions to keep our competitiveness along the value chain of the automobile industry, as the main difference between internal combustion engine vehicles and electric ones is the powertrain, that is also the engine and the transmission for ICE and battery and electric motors for EVs. OEMs, in most cases, do manufacture these larger components in-house, while in the case of batteries for electric vehicles, general practice has been to get them from external suppliers, although some brands already have them as in-house operations, and some others have announced their plans to include them in their future production programs. So in this issue, however, as well as for the rest of them, we have to work hand in hand with the federal government, because there are several elements outside the automobile industry that have to be there to complement auto industry efforts, without which we won't be able to keep the competitiveness of the sector. Among other issues, there is the need to update our regulatory framework and technical standards, the development and growth of the infrastructure network to meet the demand for growing electric vehicle fleet, as well as the communication infrastructure that vehicles are demanding to enable interaction between vehicles and in infrastructure, and between vehicles and the users of vehicles and roads and other means of transportation. So again, that will be my response.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And let me invite all of the panelists, because it looks like we may have an extra minute or two, so we will actually be able to fit all four of you. So Mr. Bozzella, Mr. Champagne, Mr. Adams, Mr. Sosaya, automakers are shifting their vision from car manufacturers to mobility providers. What is the impact of this fundamental change in the industry storytelling? So if you could please take a few moments to give us your thoughts, it would be greatly appreciated.
I'll go first if that's okay. Yeah, this is really a really important question. You know, they're really, if you think about where the industry is going, there are three significant transformations that we're seeing, and they inform each other. There is the transformation to electrification, which we've been talking about. there's the transformation toward more highly automated vehicles, sort of advanced safety systems, and ultimately highly automated vehicles. And then there's a third transformation, which is really a digital transformation that really is about how people consume personal transportation. And we do see a movement from ownership to access, very similarly to how we might have imagined, or how we have seen, for example, the shift in how people consume music, for example. And so I do think that that trend is one that will continue. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what effect has the pandemic had on that trend? And we do need to understand that, certainly on a temporary, on an immediate basis, rather, as a result of the pandemic, we might see a slowing of the idea of sharing mobility as opposed to owning a vehicle. So it is a big question, sort of what happens post-pandemic. With regard to the narrative, the industry narrative, this is all about companies having the opportunity to continue to innovate and transform. This industry has been around for well over 100 years. And what you're seeing in companies that are transforming is companies that are not only staying relevant, but redefining transportation. And that bodes well for this industry, for investors in this industry, and for workers in this industry going forward.
I think if I could pivot off of what John was saying, I think if you look at vehicle manufacturers as they would define themselves now, and I think into the future, rather than being vehicle manufacturers, I think they're looking at things through the lens of, if I want to be in business 20 years from now, what does that look like? And I think more and more manufacturers are starting to define themselves as mobility service providers. So whatever way or shape or form that takes, more to John's point about is how does a consumer end up consuming transportation? And certainly, as John said, the pandemic has put a bit of a wrench, I think, in the shared transportation model for obvious reasons. And so we've seen some slowdown in the activity that would have otherwise been there. But I think in the connected space and the automated space and the electrification space, if we think of connected, automated, shared, and electrified, the case model that's been referenced before in the conference, those other three pillars have sort of moved forward. And in that regard, I think really Canada is sort of uniquely positioned to advantage itself in that new case environment, because we really have, which is not known to many people, we really have, a unique cluster in Southern Ontario that's called, the Automotive Innovation Network, which really goes, depending on how you define it, from Windsor to Quebec City or from Waterloo to Toronto, anywhere where you have a unique nexus of academic resources, vehicle production, and also very advanced component and technology providers in that cluster that are going to be essential for the connected, automated, shared, and electrified world going forward. So I think Canada is well positioned to take advantage of the new mobility, I guess, as we see it. But obviously, I'll leave where I started, that for a vehicle manufacturer in this day and age to look at the future and say, what does it look like? It looks like being a mobility service provider, I think. And and just another interesting Canadian example of that, Toyota recently signed an agreement with Lyft out in Vancouver to basically put their most advanced technology, their Mirai fuel cell vehicles, into the possession of Lyft drivers, which does a bunch of things that actually puts the technology where it's most highly utilized in a fleet operation like that. It also gives both the drivers and the consumers really experience with the technology, which is key to broader adoption. And just like we've seen, years gone by with Toyota and their Priuses, for instance. Sounds like I'm a shill for Toyota, but I'm not. But really, with taxi drivers using Priuses, they became essentially the best salespeople for that technology going forward. And I think moves like that in terms of getting the product into the hands of fleets can be the best way forward in a lot of ways of ensuring that this technology gets accelerated into the marketplace.
Maybe I'll also, slightly look at it from a little different angle, but really say that there's no question that in the pursuit of increasingly autonomous fleet, an increasingly electrified or zero-emission vehicle, the path forward for automakers is really through how we're going to manage data. The data conversation is one that's key right now, and very much as John was referencing into the music industries, and I will probably add to it also as the influence of data into media, general mainstream media, and we saw its impact through the last elections in the United States and the previous one. There's now a bigger conversations about data privacy. And I think that this global conversations about how we're going to own and control our data in light of a fleet that might be increasingly shared rather than owned by personal individual creates all sorts of conversations. And obviously for us from an automotive aftermarket, it's key because our capacity to effectively, cost effectively and safely repairing vehicle relies on and depends on our capacity to properly access the information that's needed. And so this is very interesting conversations to have, and there's no questions from an automaker perspective and all of the stakeholders in the automotive space. How are we going to increasingly use data as a way to provide for better mobility is key for everyone's future, and it will continue to play, I think, an increasingly important role in the year to come. But I'll close by saying that the pandemic, I think, at least from a consumer perspective, enable all of us to, I think, fast forward, 9 years in a span of 9 months. I don't know what that is, but we really accelerated our understanding, I guess, of technology and the use and being more confident about technology. And so we might have skipped a few steps that we might have to look back in the future, but at least we've had this acceleration of, I think, making people more comfortable in the use of technology.
Well, if I may make some comments on this also, I think that at last, for the last decade, the automobile industry has been on the path of radical transformation. I see also some analysts have pointed out that we are facing the biggest revolution, or as Francois said, evolution in the automobile industry since Henry Ford introduced serial manufacturing and at the beginning of last century. This transformation is the result of both industry's internal evolution and the development of external issues. These are elements as various as Industry 4.0, advances in digitalization, information technology, and big data, to changes in consumption patterns. These factors have allowed non-traditional automobile competitors, such as large technology companies, to enter in the race for the auto market. To remain competitive, the OEMs are becoming mobility providers, transforming its traditional business as manufacturers and sellers of vehicles. Among the causes of this transformation is the mega trend of global urbanization that has resulted in saturation of large cities' infrastructure, being the cause of severe vehicle congestions at peak hours and the lack of parking place, forcing the search for alternative solutions to facilitate transportation of city dwellers, such as shared vehicles. With respect of technological advances and changes in consumer expectations, it seems vehicles are becoming more like a personal device, like a cellular on wheels, and users are no longer interested in the owner of vehicle, particularly younger generations, because of the cost of involved, but rather prefer to have access to use the right vehicle at the right time without having to be the owner of that vehicle. It seems consumers tend to value more the travel experience than the ownership of the vehicle. In addition, technological advances are taking us every day closer to autonomous vehicles that will force increasing connectivity of vehicles with other vehicles, vehicles with infrastructure, and vehicles with vehicles users and road users. Under such environment, OEMs have been forced to reinvent their role in the face of these new circumstances through the implementation of measures and on three broad branches. First, new ecosystem and business model to identify new solutions and the use of new technology. Second, partnership with technology leaders to reduce risks and explore new opportunities. And third, increase efficiency by exploring and applying new technologies like artificial intelligence and attracting new talent for developing new business models. We are certain that we are at the beginning of a path that does not seem to be flat and straight, but rather winding, turbulent, and difficult. However, as it has been along the automobile industry history, crises also generate opportunities. And in this sense, we are certain that the traditional value chain of the automotive industry will be able to overcome the challenges that arise in the short term and will be able to identify and implement the necessary measures to take advantage of the new business models in the long term. Thank you.
Maybe Guido, if I could just jump in and offer one more comment to augment, I think what Jose said and what John has said previously as well. You know, I think it's one thing for the automotive industry to be putting new forms of propulsion on the road. It's one thing to be saying, okay, we can move down the roadway towards automated vehicles. And, you know, sometimes I think implicit in that discussion is the view that this is something that consumers really want. And it may well be, but I think it speaks to, I think, the awareness issue that John raised, you know, almost at the outset of our discussion today, that, you know, awareness is, I think, higher in Canada, for instance, than it may be in the US about electric vehicles. But, you know, there's a incongruency between public policy where they would like to go on things like, you know, electric vehicle penetration, for instance, and the whole, how do we get to fully automated vehicles and having those be ubiquitous on our roads. But there is, we can never forget you know, that somebody has to buy the technology first, whether it's an electric vehicle or an automated vehicle. And, you know, there's a lot of education that needs to be done, you know, some by the industry, of course, but I think it's a broad-based effort that needs to be undertaken to make sure people are comfortable with nobody sitting behind the steering wheel, for instance, or even just the advanced driver assistance systems that are on vehicles these days. You know, it's not uncommon for consumers to be a little bit disconcerted by the lights that come on and the noises that are made when you know, things happen that are designed to actually protect them from a safety perspective. So we can't leave the consumer behind in this journey, is all I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. On a personal note to all of the panelists, I want to thank you profusely because, you know, rookie that I am, I began 2 minutes behind schedule and you guys have managed to stay on track. You know, as a matter of fact, you guys are so good, we managed to sneak in a few more questions. So again, on a personal note, thank you so much. And let me recap here in regards to what we've addressed today. I've found the second half of the conversation to be wonderful. And we've spoken about two things. The first part of the equation is, does the consumer really want electrification? And as I personally like to describe it, is the boots and buckles consumer ready to basically plug in their vehicle with the special needs that we have, whether it's distances, towing capacities, and so on and so forth. So do we have a full understanding of where the consumer is at, given the vast region that we have in North America and the particular needs weather-wise, infrastructure-wise, and so on and so forth. Then we basically migrate over to how the industry is basically tackling the electrification process, as well as some of the challenges that they may have. You know, it's basically looking at making sure that we have the bandwidth, necessary bandwidth, to look at all of the retooling that needs to happen as a result of this. Plants ready, people ready, distribution ready, and so on and so forth. Particularly, the biggest challenge as we're moving on to that is, you know, reflecting on comments from all of you, you know, we're really talking about 2% electric or electric hybrid in most countries, migrating over to objectives in a not so distant future where we want to go fully electrified by by about 2035. So definitely a steep curve when it comes to that. And as we basically move on forward from electrification, we also need to think about what automated vehicles are going to bring, and the transformation that we are going to see with the OEMs themselves. I absolutely loved we're going from ownership to access, very much like the music industry. And this is a very critical point that all of us within the industry need to understand in order to survive. The good news is, at least the OEMs are not being caught by surprise. Great news for their business plan, great news for investors. But in the process, we need to make sure that we know how to manage that data and take on this revolution that is really becoming an evolution, and particularly understand one last critical point here that Mr. Sosaya made is, up to this point, we thought that there was a clearly defined path of mobility. And the pandemic has certainly rattled that, and we do not know what the long-term implications of mobility may be further down the road. With that, again, to the panelists, thank you so much. Delighted to have joined you, and all the best. Thank you, everyone.